Good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua O'Driscoll. I am the Assistant Curator of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts here at the Morgan Library. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our two speakers, Asa Mittman and Sherry Lindquist, the guest curators of the newly opened exhibition, Medieval Monsters, Terrors, Aliens, Wonders. If you haven't had the chance to see the show yet, I highly encourage you to visit the gallery after the lecture. The museum will remain open until 9 o'clock this evening. If you'd like to find out more about other scheduled events relating to the exhibition, you can pick up a calendar as you leave the auditorium. And I'd also like to mention that there is a wonderful book catalog associated with this exhibition, and you can purchase that at the gift shop. So, bringing together more than 60 examples from the Morgan's renowned collection of illuminated manuscripts, as well as select loans from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the exhibition examines the various functions of monsters and the monstrous in medieval societies. This spectacular display of art, ranging across the entire span of the European Middle Ages, from the 9th to the 16th centuries, was made possible through the generous support of an anonymous gift in the memory of Melvin R. Seddon, the Janine Luke and Melvin R. Seddon Fund for Exhibitions and Publications, the Andrew W. Mellon Research and Publications Fund, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Mrs. Alexander P. Rosenberg. Unlike other exhibitions or even books dedicated to the topic of medieval monsters, this current exhibition breaks new ground by challenging us to think critically about the very idea of the monstrous in the Middle Ages and how it could serve as a way of engaging with the unknown, the foreign, and the supernatural. This truly transformative approach to the topic is the result of the guest curator's long-standing engagement with the material, which I hope will be evident from even this brief overview of their careers as scholars. Asa Simon Mittman is professor and chair of art and art history at California State University, Chico. He is the author of Maps and Monsters in Medieval England from 2006, co-author of Inconceivable Beasts, The Wonders of the East and the Beowulf manuscript in 2013, and author and co-author of numerous articles on monstrosity and marginality, including pieces on Satan and race in the Middle Ages. He edited the research companion to Monsters and the Monstrous in 2012, and is currently co-editing a monster studies source reader, as well as a volume on monstrosity, disability, and the post-human in the medieval and early modern worlds. Sherry C.M. Lindquist is the Associate Professor of Art History at Western Illinois University and currently holds the Dorothy Kaiser Hohenberg Chair of Excellence in Art History at the University of Memphis for the term 2017 to 2019. Her publications include Agency, Visuality, and Society at the Chartreuse of Champmont from 2008, Meanings of Nudity in Medieval Art from 2012, and numerous articles on medieval and Renaissance art and visual culture, gender, neo-Gothic architecture, and the history of museums. Her activities as a curator include an exhibition on medieval monsters at the Figge Art Museum in 2013, as well as Monster Marks, which is currently on view until July 23rd at the Art Museum of the University of Memphis. As you can see, it would be hard to imagine a better pair of curators for an exhibition on medieval monsters. Having worked with them myself on this show over the course of the past 3 years, I can say that it is not just their deep knowledge of the subject matter, but also their unflagging enthusiasm and their collegial spirit that make them truly ideal collaborators. With that, please join me in welcoming Sherry Lindquist and Asa Mittman, who will be speaking to us tonight about the monstrous other in medieval art.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming. A wealthy French reader, seated comfortably perhaps in his or her home in Angers, pages through a remarkable new book. A wondrous volume just completed. It is a book of the marvels of the world, and it contains within it over 50 illuminations of locations throughout the world, near and far, highlighting purported curiosities of their landscapes, flora, fauna, and peoples. Through the lens of this book, everywhere and every one becomes exciting and exotic, but not equally so. The peoples of Britain and France and Germany might have unusual hats or unusual cows, but the peoples of more distant regions are vastly more remarkable, and their differences from their readers more dramatically pronounced. Among the more wondrous locales in this book of marvels of the world is Ethiopia. Crammed into this illustration are 24 beings. At the upper left, there are dragons and basilisks, monsters that hatch from chicken eggs and then can turn a person to stone with a glance. There's a giant bird of prey with ram's horns. This may be the mythical phoenix, who, though utterly alone as the only one of its kind, lives forever by immolating itself upon a pyre when it approaches 500 years old, only to emerge from the fires restored to youth. But it is depictions of unusual peoples that are both the focus of this image and the focus of our talk tonight. At the lower left are cave-dwelling lizard eaters. Just past them, striding to the right, is a wild man, a sort of Sasquatch figure, highly popular in medieval art, and one we'll return to. He carries a rough-hewn club that indicates both his strength and his barbarity. Above him are a pair of blemmies. Also, surprisingly and popular in medieval art, these are people with no heads, who bear their faces on their chests. According to some texts, they're 8 feet tall. To their right are people who worship a dog idol. They're up at the top. Probably a veiled anti-Muslim insult, which I'll talk about later. The naked philosophers, known as gymnosophists, are here. Ascetics, clothed in hair shirts like John the Baptist, appear. A golden giant. Naked women who converse calmly in public with naked men, as if there's nothing odd about that. People who cannot stand and so crawl upon the ground. A furry giant, known as a pan-oti, whose ears are so large that he sleeps in them at night, using one beneath him as a mattress and the other over him as a coverlet. Each figure is individually diverting, but collectively these alien beings render Ethiopia as a wild land, a world turned upside down, where Europe's conventions, practices, and mores are openly rejected. Returning to the blemmies, roughly at the center of the image, we find that they are gesturing as if in conversation. The closer one, emphatically sexed as male, frowns while pointing at the naked philosophers and a king. The other, apparently seated on the ground, bears a more ambiguous expression. The illumination seems to invite us to speculate. What are they talking about? What are they thinking? What do these people make of those people? And what are we, seated on our comfortable cushion back at home in France, supposed to make of it all? Medieval authors and artists frequently presented beings like these in collective sets, in conglomerations of difference, of strangeness, of what academics have taken to calling otherness. This group of peoples is part of a loose set that first appears in classical sources. Their ultimate origins are somewhat obscure, but they seem to have made it into classical art and literature via a pair of Greek travelers, Ctesias and Megasthenes, who claim to have learned about these peoples in India and in Persia, and whose accounts were then borrowed and popularized by the Greek historian Herodotus, whose reports were then borrowed in turn by the 1st century Roman Pliny the Elder for his widely popular natural histories. From there, they're disseminated throughout numerous classical and medieval genres. Such beings, headless blemmies, lizard-eating cave dwellers, and the rest, are grouped together in books of marvels like this French manuscript that opens the aliens section of our exhibition. They appear in bestiaries, that is, books of beasts. They're popular in travelogues, whether rooted in actual travels like those of the famous explorer Marco Polo, or placed in entirely fictional narratives, like the Book of John Mandeville, a forged account of the wide-ranging journeys of, as this text tells us, one, quote, John Mandeville, knight, although I am not worthy, born and raised in England in the town of St. Albans, who from there have crossed the sea in the year 1322. They were also clustered together on many of the world maps that survive from the Middle Ages. Such as this tiny gem of a map. Here you see it blown up to 15 feet tall. In fact, it is about 3 inches in diameter. It was made in 13th century England, probably for a royal patron, and appears as a sort of frontispiece to a book of the Psalms. A simpler medieval map will help orient you. The medieval globe has just the 3 continents then known, which are the 3 accounted for in the Bible, which was considered the most reliable of all sources. So, Asia, Europe, Africa. Asia is perhaps surprisingly at the top. That is, medieval maps are generally oriented toward the Orient, hence the origin of that term. Asia's importance, reflected in its literally superior position, was based on its role as the site of Jerusalem and of the Garden of Eden, seen as a literal, tangible place in the easternmost edge of the inhabitable landmass, as well as the location of all the main events in the life of Jesus, from his birth in Bethlehem to his baptism in the River Jordan, through his preaching, miracle-working, arrest, torture, death, and resurrection. At the apex of the map, Christ is flanked by sensing angels. He's blessing with one hand and holding an orb of the world, which medieval artists and authors knew to be a sphere, in his other. On the other end, at the nadir, pressed down by the weight of the world, are a pair of wyverns, two-legged dragons symbolizing evil. Like most such maps, called Mappae Mundi, literally meaning cloths or sheets of the world, Jerusalem is at the very center, the navel of the world, aligned vertically with Christ, the Garden of Eden, and the rivers of paradise, and the vertical Mediterranean, known in the Middle Ages as Mare Magnum, the Great Sea. At the lower right, as you have surely already spotted, are another set of monstrous, wondrous peoples. Here they appear to be locked in little blue and orange boxes, bounded to the north by the waters of the Nile, and to the south by the waters of the great ocean that encircles the Ecumene, the inhabitable world. Working from west to east, that is, from bottom to top, we encounter the following: an anthropophagic cynocephalus, that is a dog-headed human eater who is munching on a human leg. An anthropophagus, that's a cannibal also eating a human leg. A crawling himantopodes. An antelope-riding, cave-dwelling troglodyte. An epiphagi with his eyes on his shoulders, and his close cousin and our old friend, the blemy, with his face on his chest. A large-lipped amictriae, a single-footed sciopod who runs very swiftly and uses his large foot to shade himself from the hot southern sun. A four-eyed Mauritani Ethiopes, whose excellent sight makes him a formidable archer. The Salmire, who are immune to snake venom and who expose their newborn infants to asps and vipers as a sort of high-stakes paternity test. A person who speaks using gestures, a tiny-mouthed straw drinker, an Arabatites who walks stooped over, and last of all, people without noses. These are not to be taken as one-off individuals, not as singular omens, which were referred to in the period as prodigal births, like the two-headed calf born in Nuremberg and illustrated by the great German printmaker Albrecht Dürer. Rather, they are reproducing, mating, breeding groups. This is made clear by the frequent presentation of pairs of figures, and occasionally even of monster families, that mirror and parody human family structures of mom, dad, and baby, as in the case of these families of Panoti and wild people. The importance of reproduction to an understanding of these beings is also accentuated by the vigorous sexing of such figures, who often bear oversized, brightly colored, or otherwise emphasized genitals, all the more striking in the context of the generally discreet art of the Middle Ages, as in this page from an English manuscript of the Book of Mandeville. But what are we to call them? The terminology here matters a great deal. Traditional scholarship has, since the 19th century, called these groups of beings the Plinian Races, due to their popularization by Pliny the Elder, or perhaps more commonly, the Monstrous Races. What does it mean to call these peoples monstrous races, or races at all? The Middle Ages, as has been noted by other scholars, did not exactly have a word for race that maps perfectly onto the modern term. Medieval Latin texts call such groups gens, natio, or gentes, terms that are about lineage and lines of descent. Natio gives us both nation and natal, as in prenatal. Early medieval English authors used mancune, which is a kind of man, and Middle English authors used kinda, kind, and then eventually kin, family. Race, though, doesn't appear until the late 15th century, and it is there used to refer to a difference of status rather than of what we might think of as race. Indeed, its earliest known usage is in Jacques de Brézé's The Hunt, a poem written at the end of the 15th century, where it's used to describe hunting dogs. It goes on to be used to describe groups of animals and then to distinguish between noble and common animals, between hunting greyhounds and ordinary watchdogs. Following this usage, race then comes to be applied to noble people, especially those of so-called royal blood. This use of race is different in substantive ways from modern usage, as it was used to distinguish not only one type of dog from another, but also people of a certain position in the social hierarchy from those of another position, regardless of shared political space, equally European ancestry, similar phenotype, and on. That is, French royalty was considered a different, quote-unquote, race than French peasantry. This should serve as a reminder that systems of race are, and have been since the term was first used in any language, not neutral descriptors of human variety, but pointed systems of hierarchy. As we confront these monstrous somethings, these monstrous someones, we must keep very much in mind that these headless people, these dog worshippers and cannibals and dogheads and lizard eaters and the rest, were considered to be the real and living inhabitants of Ethiopia. As such, fun though they are to look at, they're also part of a long and deeply pernicious strategy of demonizing real groups of people. This persistent tactic, running from at least as far back as the ancient conflicts between the Greeks and Persians and prevalent throughout the world's history, is the depiction of cultural others as not, or perhaps not quite, human. While this rhetorical strategy was not codified under the rubric of race until the Enlightenment, it was clearly present in visual and textual rhetoric for much longer. Yes, Carl Linnaeus, the Enlightenment biologist who gives us the Linnaean taxonomy by which every organism gets classed by genus and species, who in the first edition of his Systema Naturae, published in 1735, divides humans, Homo sapiens, the term he gives us, into 4 subspecies: Europaeus, Afer, Asiaticus, and Americanus. He then unsurprisingly concludes that the most advanced is Homo europaeus. But he did not actually invent this notion of strategic hierarchical categorization. Rather, he merely adapted long-standing models for the characterizing, classifying, and cataloging of human difference into the new scientific paradigm. We should therefore not be surprised to find that in the 10th edition of this very popular work, he added 2 subcategories of Homo sapiens: Homo sapiens ferus, that is feral or wild people, and Homo sapiens monstrosus, that is monstrous people. To be clear, the modern term race refers not to a biological fact, but an ideology, a horrible one used to justify repression, slavery, and genocide. While neither the word race nor the pseudo-scientific ideology of race as we know it existed before the 15th century, the Middle Ages was not innocent of what we would recognize as racial prejudice. Words like gens, natio, gentes, man, kun, and kinda, nation, people, blood, tribe, and lineage, had racial implications. And certainly people were stigmatized, oppressed, exiled, and murdered based on perceived differences of those considered outsiders. A number of scholars find aspects of modern racial ideologies, what might be called Proto Racism, that eventually, though it should be emphasized not inevitably, converged in the modern version of racism. Historian Robert Bartlett argues that in the Middle Ages, ethnicity was situational and strategic, determined not by skin color or physical characteristics per se, but by religion, language, law, and custom. Then as now, denigrating attitudes and hateful beliefs were effectively conveyed in imagery.
This 15th century tapestry, presiding magisterially over the exhibition, can help us further explore the complexities of representations of the monstrous other in medieval art. Clearly designed to impress and delight, and an extraordinarily valuable object when it was made, the 16-foot-long, highly accomplished weaving is finished on both sides with the faces painted and embroidered. The crests and shields in the lower border indicate that it may commemorate an alliance between two Alsatian noble families. On the far right, on the far left, a band of giant furry wildmen attack a castle inhabited by what 15th century people would have identified as Moors or Saracens, that is, fictionalized, racialized, denigrated notions of dark-skinned Muslims. Some of the Moors in the tapestries, including the king and queen, are shown with exaggerated features, large eyes, bright red lips, and absolutely black skin, part of a recurrent European tradition of stereotyping and demonizing people of African descent. This is particularly evident when comparing their faces to those of the light-skinned wildmen, who are shown with more naturalistic modulations in skin tone, as well as individualized features and expressions. Both the wildmen and the Moors were conceived as foreign peoples inhabiting lands far away, like the exotic beings appearing on the maps and in the books of marvels that Asa discussed. Such exotic beings, appearing frequently in European Christian art of the Middle Ages, served two object lessons. In the first place, they are meant to teach norms by negative example. The dominant ideology in medieval Europe privileged predominantly light-skinned, wealthy, heterosexual, able-bodied Christian males. The ruling class was typically represented clothed, self-possessed, and restrained in pose and expression, like the Christ on the Psalter map. It is important to note that what this model promulgated as normative was not normal or common. In fact, it excluded the majority of the population. Some of the contorted, nude humanoids in the Psalter map are literally bestial, and others lack even minimal evidence of civilization from the European perspective, such as wearing clothes or refraining from cannibalism. Presented as exotic barbarians at the edge of the world, they were meant to reinforce the presumed superiority of European Christians, their religion, and their culture. The second lesson conveyed by Monstrous peoples is theological. Their significance is taken up by the early Christian African bishop St. Augustine of Hippo, whose influence on the theological infrastructure of Christianity is incalculable. He asserts that man was made one, even woman was made from him. There are not several races of men as there are species of herbs and trees, fishes and winged creatures, serpents, wild beasts, and grazing animals. In order to contend with the monstrous peoples believed to exist at the far reaches of the earth, Augustine wrote in his blockbuster book, The City of God, "These things which happen contrary to nature and are called monsters, phenomena, portents, prodigies, ought to demonstrate, portend, predict that God will bring to pass what he has foretold regarding the bodies of men. No difficulty preventing him, no law of nature prescribing to him his limit." In other words, prodigies and monsters exist to show that God can do what he wishes, that he can make humanoids with dogs' heads or no heads, even as he can resurrect human bodies at the end of time and cause their flesh to burn eternally in hell if he sees fit. Augustine is not sure that the monstrous peoples described by Pliny and others exist, but if they do, their humanity is not to be determined by their physical qualities. Whoever is anywhere born a man, that is, a rational mortal animal, no matter what unusual appearance he presents in color, movement, sound, nor how peculiar he is in some power, part, or quality of his nature, no Christian can doubt that he springs from one protoplast, that is, Adam. Thus, those who are ruled by the flesh rather than the rational soul, as women were thought to be, distance themselves from reason, and deficiency of the rational soul places one's humanity in question. Lack of rational capacity diminishes the ability to recognize God, as exhibited by heretics, infidels, pagans, and sinners. Negative associations with dark skin derived from metaphors connecting darkness with evil and light with good, which proliferated in the ancient world, including among classical writings and Jewish and Christian commentaries on the Bible. It was the 3rd century theologian Origen, another of the most influential early Christian church fathers, who extended the metaphor to dark-skinned Ethiopians, who came to symbolize sin for him and the Christian tradition he influenced. It is important to emphasize that the medieval European notion of Ethiopia had no basis in ethnographic or geographic fact. Indeed, the Latin name Ethiopian, not the indigenous name of any African group, derives from the Greek, literally meaning burned-faced people. Dark-skinned Ethiopians came to symbolize evil as inscribed on the bodies of imagined sinners or even demons. This is one of many possible examples in which demons are not just dark-skinned, but seem to be given stereotypical African features. Origen argued that the Ethiopians mentioned in the Bible symbolized the Gentiles whose hearts were black in spirit, but who became white and fair upon conversion. Jean Gerson, a 15th century theologian influential at the time our tapestry was made, I'll tell you about that in a minute, wrote that the image of God imprinted on the mirrors of our souls becomes clouded with dark shadows of vices and evil and base worldly and fleshly desires. According to him, we must strive to embody virtue, since the imagination of an Ethiopian leads to the likeness of an Ethiopian rather than the image of God. Thus, an inconsistent code in medieval texts and images arose that marked humans and humanoids considered primitive, inferior, corruptible, or evil. These characteristics include bestial elements, horns, tails, hooves, fur. Maybe it's best to go back for a moment. Awkward and disproportionate bodies, exaggerated expressions and or caricatured facial features, sexual and other behaviors that contravene social expectations, strange or inadequate clothing, and also dark skin. Metaphorically, one's moral behavior could cause one to change back and forth from black to white or human to subhuman. Indeed, a few such texts, such as the Middle Chaucer Cursor Mundi, posit that conversion to Christianity would literally, physically transform a figure from black and blue as lead to white as milk. This is a theme evident in the margins of a prayer book I address in a forthcoming article, The Hours of Mary of Burgundy, in which the princess is famously shown devoutly contemplating her book. In it, she confronts a series of wild people and other anti-human or human-like anti-models. On one folio, a sinful soul, mentioned in the nearby text, is cavorting with a diaphanous veil that dips into a V to emphasize her sex. She is to be associated with the one-footed sciopod opposite her in this opening, one of the so-called monstrous peoples illustrated on the Psalter map that Asa introduced. Her sinful ways are endangering her human status, a point demonstrated when Mary turned the folio to find the figure in the same place on the verso among strawberries that stand for the base desires of the flesh, apparently morphing into a less than human wild woman. This marginal vignette makes explicit the moralizing and condemnatory valences of representations of exotic peoples, illustrating our atlas of the marvelous peoples of the world. Wild people were conflated with Ethiopians, as is evident from the furry wildman with his primitive club. Sorry, I should have shown you that. It's not as sensitive as I thought it was. Wild people were conflated with Ethiopians, as is evident from the furry wildman and his primitive club striding across the foreground of the rendering of Ethiopia. Despite the long-standing connection for Europeans between Ethiopia and dark skin, dark-skinned people are curiously absent from this image of Ethiopia, suggesting a kind of interchangeability of characteristics denoting the other. Dangerous difference is marked for the European reader not merely by the bodies of these wondrous peoples, but also by their religion, their law, customs, and presumably language. It must be said that these kinds of prurient images of fantastic creatures and unfamiliar naked peoples reveal not only anxiety about difference, but also, as Jerome Cohen has argued, curiosity and desire. Sometimes we fear our own transgressive desires, and we make monsters of them as a kind of safety valve or escapist fantasy. One such fantasy among medieval Christian rulers confronting rival Muslim powers was the tale of Prester John, a wealthy Christian king, a descendant of the Magi, who lived somewhere in India or Africa. He ruled over the strange peoples and beasts thought to live there, and he was ready to put his military might and wealth at the disposal of the Christian kings to defeat the Muslims. If only they could find him. This 16th century map, included in the famous Mercator Atlas, reflects some real advances in map making for navigation since the time of the Salter map, and yet it still maps ideology as much as geography. We still often use world maps based on Mercator's map projection, which, like all maps, contains many geographic and ideological distortions. This map of the land of Prester John identifies him as ruler of the Ethiopians. Although Ethiopia functioned for Europeans as a sign for difference, which could be and was read allegorically as sin, as discussed, it was also seen as an exotic and elusive source of wonder and wealth. It was dangerous and enticing, frightening and alluring. Portuguese explorers sent to Africa were specifically charged to seek the mythical kingdom of Prester John, which of course they did not and could not find. Representations of Prester John showed him with both with light and dark skin. He came to be represented with dark skin in later centuries more often as European contact with real Ethiopians became more common. We have seen that in our medieval travelogue, the inhabitants of Ethiopia are light-skinned. The only dark-skinned people represented in this manuscript, full of exotic locales and their improbable denizens, are shown in Europe. Dark-skinned soldiers with tight curls held back in headbands reminiscent of turbans joined several long-bearded Saracen types also wearing the headbands. They are lined up in front of a palace or mosque with exoticizing onion domes. One has a conical hat, and another is conspicuously armed with a prodigious scimitar. These are Moors, then, dark-skinned Muslims who are pointedly contrasted with white knights, illustrating a chauvinistic text that reads in part, "The men of Europe are handsomer and stronger than those of Africa." A book such as this pictures feelings both of threat and desire for the other, an other defined not by race determined by skin color, but by a constellation of cultural characteristics presented either with a lack of accuracy or with total fantasy, all filtered through a lens of bias. This discussion of medieval European attitudes towards monsters and men wild men, and Moors lends insight into our understanding of the Alsatian tapestry we began with. Here, Moors also inhabit a landscape with wild men and exotic beasts such as monkeys and lions, a dragon, and a unicorn. Unlike the wild men, the Moors are shown with the trappings of civilization. They have a king and queen who live in a castle and wear European-style crowns. Dressed in rich, striped fabrics, fur-lined robes, and shoes, they are equipped with more sophisticated weapons, and one may be wearing chainmail. Possibly this one here. In contrast, the wild men are armed with sticks and stones and are naked except for some leaves serving as makeshift loincloths. The giants have claws on their bare feet, and their king, who has tusks, lives in the open with his wild family. We see him offering his queen a haunch of raw meat, seemingly sourced from the partially dismembered leopard corpse at his feet. Here we go. The tableau in which the three wild men bring offerings to their seated queen, who is nursing a child, seems a deliberate reference to images of the Epiphany, when the three magi pay homage to the infant Jesus, which about this time began to include a black magus. In fact, the appearance of Moors and wild men together on this tapestry is not unrelated to the development of the black magus in art, which originated in German-speaking lands around the 13th century. Although the Gospels are pretty thin on the details about the wise men, later commentators determined their number and names and interpreted them as descendants of the three sons of Noah, who were each assigned one of the three known continents of the world. Their attendance on the Christ child was thought to testify to Christianity as a universal religion. The magus given the name Balthasar was thought to have been descended from Noah's son Ham, whose descendants Noah cursed because Ham possibly mocked his father's drunken nakedness in Genesis 9:22. Biblical commentators placed Ham's descendants in Africa, considered by Western writers to be an inhospitable and sunburnt land that darkened the skin of its inhabitants, hence the frequent medieval use of Ethiopian to describe any inhabitant of Africa. Although Balthasar was described as African since at least the 10th century, he was not commonly portrayed with dark skin in European art until the 15th century. This change in Epiphany iconography has been traced back to the 13th century Hohenstaufen emperors who wished to stress hypothetical claims to sovereignty over certain Eastern Mediterranean territories. They emphasized their imperial status and ambitions by traveling with a spectacular entourage that included black servants and a menagerie of exotic animals. As part of this campaign, they also transformed the cult of Saint Maurice, an Egyptian general who was thought to have been martyred near Magdeburg when he and his Christian troops refused to make sacrifices to the Roman gods. Under Hohenstaufen rule, Saint Maurice, previously depicted as light-skinned, was for the first time portrayed as an African, dressed as a contemporary knight in sculpture on Magdeburg Cathedral, one of the great masterpieces of High Gothic art. This new model of black Christian piety in the Holy Roman Empire influenced the representation of the Magi as well, whose relics were thought to be housed in the Cathedral of Cologne. By the 14th century, the Magi were given their own imagined heraldic insignia, featuring heads of the Asian and African kings that in this example betray a measure of caricature. The head of Saint Maurice and Moors in general appeared in heraldry across Germany and Europe, and a number of these are still in use and visible in the public arena. Some of them, like St. Maurice on the crest of the Bavarian city of Coburg, were suppressed in the Third Reich and pointedly reintroduced in 1945. This situation is one of many revealing the ongoing complexity of this imagery. It can be seen positive in a way that Coburg quickly asserted in the symbolic realm that they were proud to have their city represented by the image of a black-skinned saint in defiance of the shameful racial theories of the Nazis. And yet, the totem-like image of a stylized African head on a manhole cover or a city hall in Germany or on the floor of a college chapel in California seem offensive and troubling in many ways. The image of St. Maurice, the Black Magus, and the Moor in European art became increasingly stereotyped and demeaning, but also more popular in the 15th century. These developments in visual culture no doubt reflected shifting and conflicting responses to cataclysmic events that caused Europeans to adjust their worldview, including encounters with native peoples in the Americas, Africa, and elsewhere, and the might of the Ottoman Empire, which conquered the ancient Christian capital of Constantinople in 1453. In this atmosphere, Wildman could connote a kind of prelapsarian state, a noble and potentially convertible savage, as hinted in the Proto-Christian Epiphany tableau in the Wildman tapestry. Like the Moors, Wildmen were increasingly popular heraldic emblems in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. We know that one branch of one of the families that commissioned the tapestry, the Zorns, incorporated a Moor in their arms. By commissioning and displaying this wondrous luxury object, the families participated in an imperial tradition that advertised wealth and power through claims of connections to and dominance over the wider world, inhabited by vaguely threatening but also marvelous inhabitants, like those on the tapestry, on the Psalter map, and in the Book of Marvels of the World. The Wildmen and Moors in the tapestry stood for the other, perceived as enemies, but also potential converts, monstrous subhuman beings, nevertheless created to demonstrate God's unlimited power, and to be lessons for Christians to avoid the sin believed to have stained the monstrous peoples or their ancestors.
Brace yourselves. It's going to get a bit darker yet. The strategies of alienation and control. The fantasies and fears of the dominant culture that manifest in this tapestry were not limited to the mostly imagined and mostly faraway peoples portrayed in this work. Our survey of notions of the other, of us and them as marshaled and mediated through medieval art, must also acknowledge entrenched racial hatred by Christians that was directed toward those others living within Europe, the actual Jews and Muslims who lived in many European cities. The fear that Jews and Muslims were not in actuality different enough that they might blend in with the Christian community and lead to what they thought of as miscegenation was expressed in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where it was decreed that they must distinguish themselves by dress. The first concerted effort to enforce this decree was Henry III of England's Statute of Jewry of 1253, which mandated the wearing of badges by Jews. Of yellow felt, they were in the shape of the tablets of the law and were mandated to be 6 inches high and 3 inches wide. Small Jewish children were forced to begin wearing them starting at the age of 7, an image that cannot help but recall for us the badges worn by the children of the Holocaust. Elsewhere, Jews accommodated this dictate with various versions of a pointed hat called a pileus cornutus, which became a visual denotation of Jews represented in Christian art. This item of contemporary clothing was included in representations of the Passion of Christ, thus collapsing the distance between the ancient past and the medieval present. Many representations of Christ's tormentors in passion scenes combine the Jewish hat with features considered negative by Christian artists and audiences, such as hooked noses, long beards, ungainly bodies, exaggerated facial expressions, and swarthy skin. Even though historically there were no ethnic differences between the Jews blamed with tormenting Christ and Christ himself and his apostles, they are nevertheless represented time and again as physiognomically distinct. On the left side of this 13th century prayer book from Bamberg, we see the apostles represented in events preceding Christ's arrest, from the entry into Jerusalem to Christ addressing God in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the top register on the right side, only the temple police are shown wearing pilii cornuti that are so exaggerated they extend beyond the borders of the miniatures. The figures are dressed in short tunics associated with people of lower status. The man shown forcefully grasping Christ's left hand has an especially large hooked nose and a bizarre frill protruding from the end of his beard that echoes the ruffled point of his cap. Even though the gospel texts are clear in stating that it was Roman soldiers who flogged and crucified Christ, the middle register shows caricatured Jews meting out that punishment. The figure of Simon of Siren, whom the Gospels report was compelled by the Romans to assist Christ in carrying the cross, is shown with a Jewish hat, but without those characteristic caricaturized features of the other Jews seen wearing it. It may be because Christian theologians saw him as a sympathetic figure, underscoring the illusion that medieval people regularly made between exterior appearance and interior qualities. Sometimes Jews were even represented as literal monsters, such as in this enameled ornament from a 13th century traveling chest, which shows a wyvern, that's a two-legged dragon, like we saw lurking beneath Christ's feet on the Psalter map, shown here with a bearded human head and a Jew's hat, and with a closed eye to signal that Jews were blind to Christ's divinity. Jews are particularly vilified in the famed moralized Bibles created for French royalty in the 13th century, where they're shown aligned with the multi-headed false prophet and the beast of the apocalypse. In one roundel, the archangel Michael forces a crowd of pleading Jews into the mouth of hell, alongside the defeated apocalyptic beast. In another, the heads of the Jews, marked by yet more pointed hats, seem mere extensions of the many heads of the false prophet, as they are all again being thrust into a yawning hellmouth. Such images connecting Jews to the tormentors of Christ and to demons rationalize hatred for Jews, which frequently led to pogroms, forced conversions, and exile. Conversion narratives are another part of this ubiquitous anti-Jewish propaganda. Included in one chronicle beginning with Genesis and ending in the reign of Henry II of England is a miracle of the Virgin involving a Jew from Bourges, claimed to have occurred in the 6th century. According to the story, a young Jewish boy, captivated by the Christian Mass, is given communion directly by the Virgin Mary. When his father finds out, he's enraged and throws the child into a furnace. Thus, he serves as an antitype for Abraham, whose willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac at God's command is traditionally seen as a virtue. The Jew's horrified wife runs for help and returns with her Christian neighbors. When they put out the flames, the boy, having been miraculously protected by the Virgin Mary, is discovered seated unharmed on the hot coals. The Christians then throw the father in the oven, which forms a visual parallel to hell. There, he is entirely consumed by the flames. This alleged miracle leads the fictional boy and his mother and other members of the Jewish community of Bourges to convert to Christianity. In this manuscript, the story is illustrated with two scenes. The father is shown in contemporary 14th century clothing, though this story purportedly took place some 8 centuries earlier. Again, the figure wears a pointed hat, though in a different style here. He has a large and awkward body and a face meant to be read as ugly, with an upturned nose designed to evoke a pig's snout. Associations between Jews and swine, whose flesh they refused to eat, were commonly made in slurs against Jews. This is explicitly illustrated in images of the so-called Judensau. This image partakes of a common ideological strategy, wherein particular traits ascribed as a means of rejection, are based on anxieties on the part of the culture enacting that rejection. The Jewish practice of keeping kosher, for example, seems to have engendered an anxiety on the part of Christians who, while following many biblical injunctions, nonetheless chose to eat pork. This anxiety surfaced in accounts of the Judensau and other places. This 14th century carving from Wittenberg was described in an anti-Jewish tract by Martin Luther, who writes, "Behind the sow, a rabbi is bent over the sow, lifting up her right leg, holding her tail high, and looking intensely under her tail and into her Talmud, as though he were reading something acute or extraordinary." Jews then, having rejected the consumption of pig's flesh as unclean, were rendered by those who did eat pork as being engaged in far more foul and scatological activities with pigs, thereby rendering Christian pork consumption a rather tame act. A similar strategy is on view in the Ethiopia image, where the bearded figures worshiping an image of a dog are likely intended to represent Muslims. Muslims generally avoided both image worship and dogs, both of which were widely embraced by Christians, and so through the same sort of perverse logic behind the Judensau image are here presented worshiping an image of a dog. The Judensau image and others like it, which school children in Nazi Germany were taken to see on field trips, is still prized by neo-Nazis. Understandably, the decision to preserve unmediated this brand of hatred in the public square is the subject of controversy in Germany, just as preserving Confederate statues that valorize slavery are controversial in the US. Such defamations across media reinforced one another, especially when juxtaposed with more positive representations of the racists. In the manuscript showing the tale of the Jew of Bourges, made about the same time as the Wittenberg Judensau, both the Christians stuffing the Jew into the flames and the converted boy are bareheaded with delicate features. The boy's body sways gracefully as he poignantly lifts his hands in protest. The wife doesn't appear in the illustrations, and in fact, Jewish women are less frequently represented in Christian art of the Middle Ages, as they are often less, and when they do, they're often less caricatured than Jewish men. One explanation for this, offered by the scholar Sarah Lipton, is that the hierarchically gendered nature of medieval Christian religious and social thought explains it. In fact, attitudes toward women in all three Abrahamic faiths drew both from the story of creation in Genesis and ancient medical writings, which defined women as inferior in various respects. This meant that Jewish women seemed less of a threat than Jewish men to the religious authority of Christian men. But the legacy of Eve meant that, like Christian women, they were still considered dangerous as temptresses whose sexuality needed to be controlled.
The illustrated story of the Jew of Bourges, like the Wildman tapestry, like the Marvels of the World manuscript, like many objects in our Medieval Monsters exhibit, suppress, exclude, and vilify multiple groups simultaneously, Muslims and Africans, Jews and women. The historian R.I. Moore memorably called the Middle Ages a persecuting society. And indeed, there are, unfortunately, additional otherized groups, some of whom are represented in our exhibit and in our book, that we have not addressed in our lecture today. Not only women, but the poor, sexually nonconforming persons, lepers, the disabled, the mentally ill, dissidents, and other others. Moore's argument was not that the persecuting society he described was simply to be expected of the barbaric Dark Ages from which we have thankfully emerged. Such stereotypes of the Middle Ages create a comforting narrative that allows us to make an other of this era, to consider medieval humans as absolutely different from us, so that we can imagine we have progressed beyond the worst of human ignorance, injustice, and atrocities. Instead, Moore argues that around the 12th century, European socio-political institutions began to perfect rhetorical strategies that exaggerated, conflated, and created threats as a means of consolidating power. They used such tactics to shape the emotions and identities of in-groups through scapegoating and demonizing others. It's not that such prejudice didn't exist before. Rather, the rising state and church bureaucracies were finding ways of organizing and weaponizing them to their advantage. The very officialness of these monstrous messages, appearing as they did in Bibles and heraldry and histories of the world, is what made them so horrifyingly effective. Indeed, monstrous artifacts of medieval hatreds persist in the public sphere today, where they can still do damage. From Moors' heads in civic contexts, to the Judenschau, to the way that neo-Nazi marchers in Charlottesville adapted medieval symbols to project their own totalitarian fantasies of normative purity. State-sanctioned hatred in the post-medieval period has led to the global slave trade, the Holocaust, the genocide of Native Americans, and other contemporary atrocities. Essentially, because the technologies of the modern era amplify the potential global scale of destructive, persecuting societies, it is imperative that we promptly and definitively condemn prejudice and hatred, and that we demand that our leaders, our media, and our textbooks also do so. In this year, the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it is appropriate to acknowledge how complicated are our monsters, how they mean, what they do, and what they can teach us. Like our own society, medieval societies were not monolithic, and their monsters, like our monsters, are not univocal or predictable. Tonight, we focused on monsters that alienate others. But if you would like to hear more, not only about the aliens, but also the terrors and the wonders in the title of our exhibit, we invite you to join our joint talk at the 92nd Street Y on June 19th, or our gallery talk here at the Morgan on June 29th. Monsters were put to many uses throughout the Middle Ages and were as often points of fascination and even of fun as of insult and exclusion. And we explore such examples as well. Still, in our historical moment, in our era of persecuting societies, it is important to look at the deep history of othering and the central role monsters and the monstrous have played and continue to play in it.
Any questions for the speakers? Yes?
Well, we have learned a tremendous amount with this exhibit. What did you learn?
What did you learn from the exhibit?
I can't. We learned so much. We learned specifics about 60 Morgan manuscripts and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, one of the, so I've been working on monsters and the monstrous in one way or another for about 20 years. There's two things I would say. One, a sort of fun and positive, which is that, you know, in my day job, I'm a professor in a university, and, you know, I write books and articles and so on. And there I pick whatever images I want, and I illustrate them however I wish, and I put whatever I want next to each other. And one of the things I learned in the process of curating this is how much the real and physical and tangible nature of these manuscripts influences how we see them, what we can show, what we can put where and how. And so that was a real different process for me. The other thing, though, that became clear, so we started working on this really about 5 years ago, is the urgency of this material. To me anyway, I feel like a lot of this work has a much sharper edge and a much greater urgency than it did when I started working on it 20 years ago. That may be partly just my own awareness of issues, but I think it may also be a change over time.
Yes, sir, in the blue.
Yes.
Asa, in your talk, you traced the word race back to 16th century, but then we got a quote from Augustine Hippo in the 5th century using the word race. Are those different?
I think you did. You point out a really a good. Thank you very much, because I think you pointed out kind of a mistake, because
Well,
we
yeah,
should be looking.
Should we repeat the?
Oh yes, we were asked that about what seeming contradiction in our talk, in which we said the word race was used for the first time in the 15th century with relationship to hunting dogs, but that I had quoted an earlier text by Augustine, and what I should have done, and I thank you for pointing this out, is go back to the original translation, which such as we should always do, and check that word, which was mistranslated, as so many words are. So many times the word race creeps into these translations because they were translated in the 18th and 19th centuries, when that was the word that scholars wanted to use because it was the culturally current concept of race at the time.
If I'm remembering correctly, Augustine says gens there, which is more of like a group, a tribe. None of the words work that well in essence, but yeah, he doesn't use. So when I say that race comes from this late medieval, very, very late medieval French context, this is the word that gives us the modern word race. There's also a contemporary, more or less contemporary, maybe slightly later, Spanish instance. It arises there as well, which gives raza. So those French and Spanish terms give us that modern word race. So yeah, we should be very careful. We really should have pulled that out when we were looking at the Augustine. Gone back to the original, yeah, and tried something else there. Maybe even just put in gens in that place to say this is this word that we often now translate as race, but didn't really mean quite the same thing.
Thank you very much for that comment.
Right behind you in the center, you ma'am? Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, first of all, for being here, giving a talk, and really putting years of work into this exhibit. I was curious about the gymnosophists that you mentioned earlier. Maybe they would seem like an anomaly when compared to the other monsters, which are so either horrifying or disfigured. I was wondering, how often are these monstrous species or races, whichever term you use, a source of knowledge?
So the question was about the gymnosophists and how often could monsters be portrayed as a source of knowledge?
So I've sent multiple answers to that. So on the one hand, the term monster is not usually the category that medieval texts give us to group them. They tend to refer to them under the rubric of wonder or marvel. And what I love about those terms, and I'd argue that monster actually is a term like that, we just don't think of it that way, is that they're about our response to them. You know something is a marvel because you marvel at it. If it evokes marveling in you, it's a marvel. The same with wonder, right? And I would say that a monster is something that evokes in you a kind of feeling of monstrosity. So we often get in catalogs of monsters figures that are not overtly horrifying in any way. The text called The Wonders of the East gives us, along with giant dog-headed fire-breathing people-eaters, the kings who have many kings under them. Okay. Also the quote-unquote generous men who are generous for giving women to passing strangers. It's a different kind of horror, but not an embodied kind. They look just like the sort of interlocutor figure who's walking through this landscape. There's no physiognomic difference or anything like that. But you said, how often are these monsters or marvelous peoples sources of knowledge? And I would say ultimately the answer to that is every single time, because that is their basic function. They exist to teach us something. This is what Augustine tells us. Isidore of Seville, another very important early medieval theologian, says the same, that they are there to demonstrate to us the powers of God. That's explicitly what medieval authors and artists saw as their function. Now, a philosopher might teach you in one way, but a dog-headed, fire-breathing, homophagic giant teaches you something also, but in a very different way.
Yes, ma'am.
Well,
Can I repeat the question one? The question was about the depictions of Jewish women and if there are any sources or good examples of depictions of monstrous Jewish women.
One reason why there's not as many depictions of Jewish women is because one place where you really find a lot of representations of Jews and Christian medieval art is in the crucifixion, and that is a subject that is repeated more than probably any other subject, and it's the men who are shown torturing Christ, not women. As far as monsterized Jewish women, I think you're more likely to find Jewish women represented as temptresses, as potential sexual temptations to Christian men, and you even see that in some representations of the personification of synagoga, who sometimes gets shown in a kind of sexy way. And there's great work by a New York scholar, Nina Rowe, on that topic. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Just a couple of things. One, analogous to the representation of Jewish women are the representation of so-called Saracen women, which is this kind of racialized idea of Muslims. And again, we'll see them in roles of a kind of exoticized, eroticized temptress figure. Often the quote-unquote Saracen princess, I say quote-unquote, this is a term of denigration. So the Saracen princess will be married to a Christian knight and then will eventually convert and so on. So we see those figures. And also sometimes in apocalypse manuscripts, the whore of Babylon is represented in garments that are meant to type her as an Eastern religious racial other, perhaps unspecified, between. They're often discussed as perhaps having something to do with Islam, but the first medieval Christian encounters with Islam declare it to be a Jewish heresy. So there's a lot of blurring between those boundaries. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, right. Another reason that you might not find so often monsterized Jewish women is that given the sort of prevailing masculinist medieval culture, the monstrous races are, generally speaking, male unless the monstrosity is explicitly gendered or sexual in nature. And so when you work through all of those figures at the side of the map, they're all most likely male, and when we go through catalogs of them, like these Wonders of the East manuscripts, male, 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 until you get to the bearded huntresses. And the whole point there is that they're an inversion of typical medieval European expectations, because women aren't the hunters, men are the hunters, women aren't bearded, men are bearded. And also, of course, instead of hunting with hunting dogs, they hunt with cats, because cats are somehow the opposite of dogs, right? And so when we see, just similar to when we see hell scenes, in hell the sins are often represented specifically, so there is greed, male, and there's anger, male, and there is gluttony, male, and there is sloth, male, and there is lust, female. So when we see female figures, they are often there in this, again, masculinist, misogynist sea that a lot of these images come out of. They're expressly for that one purpose, not simply generically present. The default representation in Monsters is almost always going to be male.
We have time for one last question. Nobody wants to ask the last question.
A couple down in the front here.
Oh, somebody over here raised their hand quickly.
There's
The front row, son. Yes. So the question was about the depictions of women in the exhibition itself, which, rather than showing depictions of Jewish or Saracen women, actually shows more often depictions of European women, and that's basically, and there were some other parts of the question.
Yes, no, it's absolutely true that most representations, or negative representations of women are, in the Christian tradition, are of Christian women. They, and usually starting out with Eve, the original femme fatale. And sometimes Eve's features even get sort of grafted on to the snake who is Satan. And then the weaknesses, the putative weaknesses of women get represented in medieval art in various ways, including some of the monsters that we have in the showing, such as the Siren, whose, tempting body and song means death to the courtiers who are lured in by her, or the Sphinx that you alluded to, where she's just too smart for her own good, and that leads to her demise at the hands of a Christian hero knight. So we don't see that many representations of as many representations of Jewish and Saracen women, not that they don't exist, and they are kind of all treated similarly and with sort of similar weaknesses. It seems, as Sarah Lipton has argued, that the fact that they were women was more important than other aspects of their identities in terms of these ideological, moralizing contexts in which they appear in imagery.
A couple of things to add to that. First off, again, thinking of the kind of general misogyny of the period, women were often viewed as not being able to seriously engage with the religious, the philosophical elements of the religion, and therefore their religious practice was often taken as somewhat less serious than male religious belief, practice, philosophy, and so on. But another thing, just to kind of bring the notions back around, so if we're talking about women in these images as appearing Christian, we should bear in mind that what we're actually saying is they appear European, because Christians by the 12th century are in Africa, they are in Asia, right? Christianity has spread quite a ways at this point, and so there is a very common move in the Middle Ages to racialize religion, which we see very much, there's sort of encapsulations of this, Sherry alluded to this in the talk, in these medieval texts that are conversion narratives, where a Saracen, in the text that Sherry quoted from, which is the Cursor Mundi, a Middle English text, the Saracens are blemmies. They're headless people who are described as being black and blue as lead. And they get converted by King David, who is a Christian in this story. But when they are converted, it says, they became as white as milk, and all their shape was made anew. So we presume their heads regrow. And he says, at that point, they had the color of high blood, which is the racialization of class. So, again, all of these things are imbricated. They all overlap. Gender, race, religion, and class are all in the Middle Ages images in a very fluid interaction, which is one of the very important elements to bear in mind when we try and grapple with what it means to characterize both the fantastic creatures and beings and peoples that we talked about, as well as when we try and grapple with medieval texts and images talking about real and known othered groups in the period.
Great. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your question, Sherry and Asa have kindly agreed to take a few more questions individually outside the lecture hall. But for now, please join me in thanking the speakers for tonight's lecture.